Hello and welcome to my beginner photography tutorial. If you clicked on this video, it's probably because you're curious about why I say to never shoot in auto, or because you just got a camera and you want to learn more about photography, which is awesome. I absolutely love photography. I've been doing it for the past 5 years now, and it has completely consumed my life. Literally everything I do revolves around cameras. So in this video, I want to help some of you out who are maybe just getting started with photography, or for those of you who want to learn how to take photos not in auto mode. A little backstory on me: the reason I got into photography is simply because I discovered what the manual mode on my camera could do. I was out with my friend about 5 years ago, and we were taking pictures in a forest, and at the time we were shooting in auto because we had no clue how cameras worked. And we were having a great time taking some photos, and then towards the end of the shoot we decided to just throw it in manual for fun, for whatever, just to see what we could do. And my friend Justin ended up taking this really moody, underexposed photo of myself. I even have that photo here, and this is that photo. And what I realized in that moment was I have the ability to think for the camera. The camera doesn't have to think for me to capture the photo. I can choose settings that will help dictate and create a photo or a look that wouldn't be captured otherwise if the camera was just in auto mode. Hope that makes sense. I don't know if that excites you at all like it excites me, but from that moment I was hooked. I literally dropped everything and spent all of my time, energy, and money into photography. I wanted to learn everything I could all about how can I manipulate light, can I capture scenes that you can't see with your own human eye, and all of this stuff was made possible by shooting in manual mode on your camera. Now, I know for a lot of people, shooting in manual, it seems super scary. Oh no, what do? I have to control everything, and it can be super intimidating. But I want to assure you, it's actually relatively simple. All you gotta learn are 3 main camera settings, that being shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. All of them are actually pretty easy to understand. They each just do 2 things, and if you can understand how they work together, they'll complete what's called the exposure triangle. It's just a fancy way of saying when you combine them together, you get the right amount of light to enter your scene to get the proper exposure for your image. So I'm going to start by just defining the 3 terms and then give some examples on my workflow on how I would create or complete the exposure triangle. Generally, you pick 1 or 2 settings and compensate with a 3rd. Pretty simple. First up is shutter speed. It's probably the easiest one to understand because it just makes the most intuitive sense. On the left side, you're going to have slow shutter speeds, something like a 60th of a second, a third of a second, multiple seconds. And the slower you go, the more motion you'll have in your shot. But you also will have a ton of light entering your shot, if that's what you need. Whereas on the right side of your screen, you're going to have a super fast shutter speed, something like a 1,000th of a second. So if you want to freeze a basketball player or something, that's what you would choose. But downside is you'll let in very little light because the shutter door is open for only a fraction of a second. Next up is aperture. This setting sometimes has the tendency to be the hardest one to wrap your head around, but it's really not that bad. All it is the size of the opening of your lens. The bigger your lens opens, the more light it lets in. It's really that simple. The only thing with aperture is also the wider your lens opens up, the thinner the plane of focus will be. Meaning that if you open up your lens really wide, you're going to have a very blurry background. And the best way to think about this is to look at your aperture, which is measured in f-stops. So you'll see it as f/8, f/4, f/1.4. And the smaller the number, the smaller the plane of focus. The smaller the number, the blurrier the background. So if you want to shoot a portrait, you're going to want to use the smallest f-stop possible, but it's the largest opening of your lens. That's what's confusing. So I just like to think of it as a small f number is a small plane of focus, blurry background. A large f number is a large plane of focus, and you would use that for landscapes. The final setting is ISO, and this one is super easy to understand, just like shutter speed was. All it is the sensitivity to light. So on the left, you're going to have low numbers like ISO 200 or 100, and your camera will not be very sensitive to light. But on the right, you're going to have very large numbers like ISO 1600, 3200, 6400, and your camera will be very sensitive to light. You're going to want to turn up your ISO when you're shooting in darker environments so that your camera is more susceptible or more sensitive to light so that it will brighten up your image for you. The downside though is that your image will get more grainy because it's sort of like adding in fake light, if you will. So yeah, you really just need to know those 3 camera settings. Shutter speed, you go from a slow shutter speed, lots of motion blur, to no motion blur, fast shutter speed, but you don't let in a lot of light. For aperture, you have a small f number, a large opening, you let in a ton of light, to a small opening, a large f-stop, you let in very little light. To ISO, you have a low number, very little grain, to you have a high number, a lot more grain, but you can see in the dark. If there was one thing that I wish I knew before starting photography, it was the fact that diagrams like this exist to help show you a visual way of understanding the exposure triangle. This helps me out immensely, and I'm sure it will help you out too. It's just a perfect visual way to show you an example of what happens to your image depending on which camera setting you manipulate. So if you want to download this, I'll have that in a link in the description down below, or you can just search camera exposure triangle diagram and a ton of these images will pop up. Go ahead and save it, print it out, throw it in your camera bag if that's what it takes. It's super handy and it will totally help you understand what's happening when you're changing a camera setting. Now the last thing I want to leave you with is my workflow on what camera setting I'm choosing and why. Because oftentimes I find with these beginner photography videos, they'll tell you all about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. You leave still feeling confused and you have no clue how to use them. So that's what this final section is all about. My workflow on how to take any photograph is I start by picking 1, maybe 2 settings and compensating with a third. Let me give an example. Say we're looking to do a portrait shoot. What I would want to prioritize is getting a blurry background. So what I would choose is an aperture like f1.8. What that will do is let in a lot of light and blur the background. Then the next setting that I would choose is ISO because I want to keep the grain to an absolute minimum. So I would set my ISO to 100, and then from there, I would just take a picture. It's going to be bright, it's going to be dark, I don't know what it will be. But then from there, what I would do is change my shutter speed to make it faster or slower until my picture becomes properly exposed. So if I take a picture and it's completely white, then my shutter speed is too slow. I need a faster shutter speed, maybe like 1,000th of a second. Or if I take a picture and it's way too dark, then my shutter speed is too fast. I need to go down to 1/500th of a second, 1/250th of a second. And that way now my exposure is back to a spot where I need it. Let's do another example. Let's say I want to do some car trail photography, where I want to have the headlights or taillights go through the whole photo and leave those really cool light streaks. This is one of the types of photos that I first learned to do when I got into photography because manual mode changed my life. What I would choose to prioritize is a very slow shutter speed. So I would do something like 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. And so what that's going to do is let in a ton of light. Then what I would do next is set my ISO as low as possible because again, I want to mitigate grain. So I would set that to 100, and now my picture is still very bright, so what I would do is set my aperture to something like f8, f16, something like that, so that now I can see all of the car trail, so that is of benefit to me by selecting a large f-stop, meaning a large depth of field will see detail in all of the photo, and it will also reduce the light because it's a smaller opening. Double a win, and that's how I would figure out the camera settings for that photo. In general, I like to use ISO as a last resort. Sometimes you have to use ISO in order to make your picture possible. If you're to shoot indoors or shoot people at night, this is one of the most difficult things to do because you need a fast shutter speed to make sure that people don't blur. And even when you choose an aperture that lets in a lot of light, sometimes it's not enough in that dark environment. So that's where you would use ISO to add in that fake light or make your camera more sensitive to the light that's in the environment and create the proper exposure. So there's a time where you would have to choose or prioritize ISO. It sounds weird to say that. I would never prioritize ISO, but sometimes you need it in order to complete your proper exposure. So I know I titled this video, Avoid Auto at All Costs. And the reason I say that is because there are multiple times where shooting in an automatic camera mode will completely ruin your photos. First example would be if you're shooting an indoor sports activity. What will happen is the lighting is going to be trash in there and it's going to be very dark. So what your camera will do in auto is it's going to lower your shutter speed to something like 1/60th of a second, sometimes even 1/5 of a second, just to let in more light so the ISO can be mitigated to a low number. But the problem is now all of your players are going to be very blurry because there's going to be so much motion blur happening. And that's not what you want at all. And so shooting in auto, that's a problem. So instead, if you were to put it in manual, you can choose the shutter speed, you can choose the aperture, and choose the amount of ISO you need, as opposed to having the camera guess and create blurry images for you. Another example would be light trail photography. Your camera will never do that on its own in auto. What the camera will do is it'll lower your shutter speed to let in a ton of light, but it'll only go so far because it presumes you're hand holding the images. Your camera would rather increase the ISO than lower the shutter speed to pull off the light trail effect. So you'd have to shoot in manual. Auto could completely mess up the photo that you're going for. Well, I hope this video has helped you understand how shutter speed, aperture, and ISO all work together to form that exposure triangle. Again, reference this image. This helped me out a ton, and I'm sure it will be super incredibly helpful for you as you're still learning and internalizing how the 3 camera settings work together. It's really just those 3 settings. If you can understand those, you can start to shoot in manual, and I guarantee you will have way more fun shooting in photography because you will have more creative control. That's what excited me the most about photography, is realizing I can think for the camera. So I hope that excites you guys, again, just as much as it excites me, and allows you to get full creative expression out of the images and art that you capture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me throughout this whole video. If you have any further questions regarding shutter speed, aperture, ISO, any other camera setting, please let me know. I would love to make another video or get back to you on helping you understand anything camera related. Again, I've spent the last 5 years doing basically nothing but camera related things. So if you have any questions, I'd love to help you out and love to help continue to grow this awesome community. Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.